For centuries, reports claimed the Vikings vanished from North America without a trace. Some said they came, they saw, and then they were gone. But what happened after their clash with Native Americans was far more intense. New evidence suggests their journey ended in bloodshed, fear, and retreat. The Vikings struggled and failed to settle in North America. But how exactly did that happen? But before we dive in, be sure to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell for more interesting discoveries. The Viking arrival in Vinland. Many theories exist about how the Vikings and the native peoples of North America lived, fought, or even traded. But to truly understand what happened between them, we need to go back to the moment the Vikings first arrived in the West. The arrival of the Vikings in North America was one of the boldest journeys in history. Around the year 1000 AD, a Viking named Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland across the cold and dangerous North Atlantic Ocean. He and his crew were following old stories about a land full of forests, good weather, and rich resources. They called this place Vinland, and it is believed to be part of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. To the Vikings, Vinland was a dream come true. Unlike Greenland, where many of them lived in cold and harsh conditions, Vinland was different. The land was green and fertile. It was also filled with trees and wild grapes, something the Vikings had never seen before in the north. The rivers were also filled with fish, and the forests were rich with animals to hunt. It seemed like the perfect place to settle. The first Viking trips to Vinland were not large invasions. They were more like scouting missions. Leif Erikson and his crew built small camps to explore the area and see if they could survive there. One of these camps has been found by archaeologists. It is called Los Olmedos. The remains show that the Vikings built wooden and turf houses, had workshops, and repaired their ships there. It was not a full settlement, but it was a real Viking base on American soil. And that was when everything began to change. But before we go any further, if you're enjoying this and love stories about the Old West, don't forget to subscribe. Leif Erikson eventually returned to Greenland, but his journey inspired others to follow. One of them was his brother, Thorvald Erikson, who sailed to Vinland a few years later. Thorvald spent more time exploring the land, and his group stayed longer. He hoped to claim more territory and possibly settle there. Others, like Thorfinn Karlsefni, went even further. Thorfinn's expedition was much larger. He brought around 160 people, including women, children, and even animals. These people were not raiders or warriors, they were settlers. Farmers, builders, and families hoping to start a new colony across the ocean. They brought tools, livestock, and supplies for a long stay. This was not just about exploration anymore. It was an attempt to create a permanent Viking community. Because of this, the settlers quickly began working. They built turf-walled houses like the ones back home. They fished, hunted, and gathered local plants. They explored the coast and gathered useful materials, especially wood, which was rare and valuable in Greenland. They even planted crops, trying to make the land their own. Even though the land was full of resources, the settlers faced major challenges. One of the biggest was isolation. Vinland was far from Greenland, too far for regular support. They could not easily get help or supplies if something went wrong. Storms and ice made travel dangerous. If a ship didn't return, there was no way to know why. Another challenge was survival through winter. Even though Vinland was warmer than Greenland, the winters were still harsh. The settlers had to store food, keep fires going, and protect their livestock. Without strong supply lines or nearby allies, everything had to be done with what they brought or found. They also had to deal with limited numbers of people. You see, even the largest Vikings group in Vinland had fewer than 200 people. That's not many when trying to start a colony. Every injury, illness, or death mattered. There were no reinforcements coming. Still, they kept trying. Year after year, groups returned to Vinland to fish, collect wood, and explore. Some stayed for a season, some for longer. But throughout their struggles in Vinland, there was something or someone else in the forests, something the Vikings did not expect. And because of this, their dream of building a new home in Vinland faced its greatest test. Stay tuned. First contact between the Vikings and the American frontier. Long before the Vikings arrived, some indigenous people had lived in these forests and along the coasts for thousands of years. To them, the land was not new, it was their home. When they saw the Vikings for the first time, they were surprised by how strange they looked. and acted. The Vikings were also surprised and did not know how to describe the people they met. They called them Skraelings, a word that didn't really mean much and was used to describe many different groups. Most experts think the Skraelings in Vinland were the ancestors of the Beothuk, a group of indigenous people who lived in what is now Newfoundland. The first contact between the two groups happened during one of the early Viking expeditions, possibly during the time of Leif Erikson or Thorfinn Karlsefni. While exploring the coast, the Vikings spotted people in the distance. They had dark hair, wore light clothing, and traveled in small canoes covered with animal skins. The Vikings were curious. These were not soldiers in metal armor like the ones they had seen in Europe. These people were completely different from anyone they had ever met. For a while, both sides simply watched each other from a distance. For the Vikings, this was something new. They had sailed to many lands like Scotland, Ireland, England, and even parts of France. They were used to enemies who looked like them and spoke similar languages. But this was different. The native people of North America had their own customs, tools, and ways of living. They wore clothes made from animal skins, hunted with bows and spears, and moved through the land quickly and quietly. They knew the forests and rivers better than any outsider ever could. At first, there was no fighting. The first meeting was cautious, but not violent. The Vikings approached carefully, offering them items like red cloth, small metal tools, and milk. The Native Americans responded with furs, skins, and other goods. These early trades were simple, based on gestures and signs. Neither side spoke the other's language, but both seemed curious about what the other had to offer. But that was not all. Another report tells of a group of Skraelings paddling their canoes to the Viking camp. They seemed surprised by the buildings and tools they saw. The Vikings were just as surprised. These were people who had never seen swords, wool clothing, or iron pots before. The exchange went well, and for a moment, it seemed like peaceful trade might be possible. But that moment did not last. As the two groups came closer, tension started to build because of the many differences between them. The Vikings saw the land as something to be taken, defended, and settled. They believed in fighting to claim what they wanted, but for the native people, this land was their home, and they didn't want outsiders taking it from them. These small misunderstandings created more tension. In fact, recent reports often tell a story of a Viking bull that broke loose and scared a group of native visitors. The loud noise and chaos made them think they were being attacked. In fear, they ran away, only to return later with more people, possibly to protect themselves or seek revenge. Another story tells of a trade that went wrong. A Viking tried to cheat a group of Skraelings by offering a sword, but not letting it go after receiving payment. From there, a fight broke out, and after that fight, the trust that existed between them began to break down. And this disunity led to fear on both sides. Another big problem between the two groups was the language barrier. They did not speak the same language, so they could not talk, understand each other's customs, or explain their actions. This made it easy for small problems to grow into serious misunderstandings. A friendly meeting could turn dangerous very quickly. At the same time, the native peoples did not know who these pale strangers were, why they had come, or how long they planned to stay. As the Vikings explored more, they began to feel uneasy. They noticed they were being watched, shadows moving in the trees, quiet sounds at night, and canoes drifting just beyond the shore. Their camps no longer felt safe. The group that once seemed large enough for building and hunting now felt too small to defend itself. However, there was one battle that may have been the breaking point. A group of Vikings, including Thorfinn Karlsefni, were attacked by a much larger group of native warriors. The Vikings were surprised and had to retreat quickly. One Norse woman, Freydis, famously grabbed a sword and shouted fiercely to scare the attackers. The Vikings managed to survive, but the message was clear: they were not welcome and they were not safe. After that, everything changed. The Vikings stopped trusting the forest. They no longer explored far from their camp. Fear replaced their hopes of a new home, and they began to ask themselves if staying was worth the danger. Yet some still tried to trade or keep peace, but the damage was already done. The native people likely saw the Vikings as invaders, and the Vikings, even with their weapons and bravery, realized they were strangers in a land that already belonged to someone else. Even though they knew all of this, they refused to go. They thought they could defeat the people of the West just like they had done in Europe. Curious to find out what happened next? Don't go anywhere. Warnings. They couldn't read. After the first fight between the Vikings and the native peoples of North America, things changed. At first, the Vikings hoped they could live peacefully in the new land, but after the clash, that hope faded. Some Viking stories claimed the native people attacked right away, but many historians believe the truth was different. The native groups did not try to fight a big war. Instead, they gave warnings and clear signs to tell the Vikings they were not welcome anymore. These signs were not in words, but in actions. But the Vikings did not understand. They were used to fighting and taking land. They did not know the customs of the people who lived there. So they missed the warnings. They thought everything was still safe. Because of that, they stayed longer than they should have, not realizing that the land and the people who lived there were telling them to leave before it was too late. So what were these signs? Let's find out. The first clear warning came when the native people stopped trading with the Vikings. In the beginning, they had been cautious, but still willing to exchange goods. Furs, tools, and food had passed between them in small, careful trades. But now, there was only silence. No one came to the usual trading spots. Canoes that used to float near the Viking camp stayed far away. Baskets of berries, dried fish, and animal skins, which had once been left at the edge of the forest, were no longer there. The people of the land were stepping back. To the Vikings, this was confusing. They had traded with many groups before, in places like Ireland, England, and even Russia. In those lands, even when things were difficult, some kind of trust usually grew over time. But here, it was different. There was no shared language, no common customs, no way to understand the signals being sent. The Norse did not realize the silence meant danger. They did not see that the native groups were warning them to leave. Instead, they misunderstood the silence as an open invitation. With no more signs of resistance, the Vikings believed the land was free to explore. So they pushed further inland. Some began cutting down more trees, building new shelters, and moving deeper into areas they had not yet seen. But they did not realize they were crossing invisible boundaries. You see, many indigenous cultures held deep spiritual connections to the land. Certain forests, rivers, and hills were not just resources. They were sacred. There were hunting grounds passed down through generations, burial sites where ancestors rested, and spiritual spaces used for ceremonies. These areas were protected, though not with fences or guards. Their importance was known through tradition and respect. The Vikings, being unfamiliar with these customs, stepped into these spaces without knowing. They fished in sacred waters, cleared trees from lands that were never meant to be touched, and set up camp in places that were never meant to be disturbed. To the native peoples, this was not just rude, it was deeply offensive. It felt like an invasion. And while the Vikings may not have intended harm, the damage had already begun. Then came the retaliation. It did not happen in a large battle. There were no loud war cries or long fights. Instead, it came quietly in the dark of night. One evening, a small Viking outpost suddenly caught fire. The flames spread quickly through the wooden and turf-roofed buildings. People ran to throw water on the flames, but the fire moved faster. By morning, most of the outpost was gone. Down by the shore, a Viking supply ship was found damaged. Its ropes had been cut, and several arrows were stuck in the wooden hull. No one had seen who did it. There had been no warning, no clear enemy. But the message was easy to understand. They were no longer welcome. Fear began to grow among the Norse settlers. At their meetings, Viking leaders began to argue. Some wanted to return home to Greenland or Iceland. They believed the risk of staying was too great. Others still believed they could make it work. They reminded the group of their proud past. The Vikings had fought and won battles in England, Scotland, and even parts of France. They had built homes in foreign lands before. Why not here? But this land was different. In Europe, they fought people who had similar ways of life. They could talk to them, even if they didn't always agree. In Vinland, they faced people with different languages, different customs, and a very different way of fighting. The native people knew the land better. They didn't meet the Vikings face to face in big battles. Instead, they used surprise, they used silence, they used the forest as their ally. Settlers began to feel watched. Strange shadows appeared in the trees. Canoes were spotted across the rivers. At night, people heard footsteps and whispers just beyond their campfires. But when they checked, no one was there. Because of this, the hunting became harder. The animals that had once filled the forests now seemed to vanish. Fish were harder to catch. Some settlers thought the native people were driving the game away on purpose. Others believed the land itself had turned against them. Winter was coming, and their supplies were running low. The settlers were stuck. Their ships were damaged. They could not send for help. They had to survive with what they had. Inside the camp, anger and fear spread. Some people blamed the leaders for pushing too far into unknown territory. Others thought they could still make peace with the native groups, if only they found the right words or gifts. A few became angry and suggested stealing food or even taking people as captives. But the wiser voices warned this would only bring more danger. But none of that was enough to make them leave until something happened on the American frontier that shocked everyone. Don't go anywhere. One night, a group of Vikings was attacked again. This time, it was deadly. Several men were killed. A woman and a child were badly hurt. Once again, the attackers disappeared without a trace. The message, however, was loud and clear. Leave now, or next time, more will die. At that point, the community began to fall apart. Trust between settlers broke down. Small groups whispered in corners, planning to take what they could and escape by sea. Others began to build stronger fences and stand guard all night, afraid of another surprise attack. Every small sound made people jump, whether it was a broken branch that fell or a bird flying overhead, even the wind through the trees. All were seen as signs of danger. Slowly, it was clear that the old Viking courage, so famous in the sagas, began to weaken. In one report from later interpretations, a Norse man named Thorhall the Hunter found himself caught in a sudden ambush while gathering supplies. Instead of running, he climbed onto a rock and began shouting loudly, banging his axe against his shield to make as much noise as possible. It startled the attackers long enough for the others to escape. The event may have been exaggerated over time, but it reflects the mindset of the settlers. They were doing whatever it took to survive, no matter how desperate or strange it seemed. There were no Viking kings nearby to send ships. There were no friendly tribes to form alliances with. There were no safe towns to escape to. Vinland was the edge of the world. Eventually, the leaders made a decision. It was time to leave. They started to destroy what they had built. They burned buildings so others could not use them. They buried tools. They wanted to leave behind as little evidence as possible, perhaps out of shame or fear, or maybe to protect their knowledge of the place. Then they left. They sailed away from the land they had once thought would be a new home. Some ships went to Greenland, others to Iceland. The dream of a Viking colony in North America was over. Later, stories began to spread. Some Vikings claimed they left by choice. Others said they had been forced out. But everyone agreed on one thing. The land they once called Vinland had beaten them. They had arrived in strength, with hopes of building a new future, but they left in silence and defeat. The native peoples had protected their home not with swords and shields, but with patience, knowledge of the land, and signs the Vikings never learned to read. They had sent warnings, pulled back from trade, and pushed the invaders away without a full war. And so, without a grand battle or a famous final stand, the Viking presence in North America quietly disappeared. There were no treaties, no final messages, no monuments left behind, just silence. For hundreds of years, their journey was nearly forgotten, lost to time and buried beneath new stories. What remained were fragments, old Norse sagas told by firelight, weathered ruins hidden beneath soil and moss, and tools left behind in a land that had once seemed full of promise. But today, we know more. Archaeologists have uncovered the traces they left behind. Historians have pieced together their story. We now know the Vikings came across the sea long before Columbus. We know they dreamed of starting a new life, and we know they failed, not from weakness, but from misunderstanding. They did not understand the ways of the people already living there. They didn't listen to the land they entered. Vinland, once a green and hopeful dream, became something else, a lesson. It was a place where strength alone wasn't enough, a place where even the boldest explorers had to pause and learn. And when they didn't, the land itself, through silence, shadow, and resistance, told them it was time to go. When you look at how the people of the West defended their home through cold nights, silence, and strategy, you don't just see resistance, you see a message. A message the Vikings did not understand until it was too late. A message that simply said, "This land is not for you." And this quote makes you think, what would you have done in their place? Held your ground and fought, or turned back while there was still time? Let us know what you think. Could you have survived a place like Vinland with no help, no clear allies, and winter always around the corner? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and remember, if you're drawn to these forgotten stories from the edge of the world, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Then hit that next video, because if this chapter really got your attention, the next one will leave you speechless.